Welcome to Passion, Purpose and Grit and Sporting Memories, part of the regular monthly sequence. Before I introduce my guest today, I just want to ask all of you who are watching and listening whether you've ever had that special eureka moment, the moment when everything clicks into place, when maybe you were riding your bike for the first time, or you got yourself, you cracked a mathematical equation. That's the feeling I had when I read this particular book. It's called The Long Win, and it's by Cath Bishop. And theoretically, we're having some pictures of it any second now. But I'll talk about my reaction to The Long Win. It seemed to chime with everything that I felt about sport and about life and about how we approach things. The Long Win ticked all of those boxes. It was both an explanation of how I was feeling and a justification to a certain extent. And it's written, as I say, by Cath Bishop, an enormously successful rower, winner of the Coxless Pairs with Catherine Gainger, an Olympic medal, world champion, British indoor rowing champions, a record 4 times, the world indoor rowing champion, representing Great Britain at 3 Olympic Games. So enormously successful as a sportswoman. And then after retiring from rowing, following Athens, a career in diplomacy, specializing in conflict issues, postings to Iraq, Sarajevo, and Bosnia, and now becoming a hugely influential leadership speaker, consultant, and commentator, rowing commentator, regular speaker on all sorts of matters with BBC Radio 4. So a hugely influential person. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome now Cath Bishop. Welcome.
Hi, great to be here with you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. We've got so much to talk about, so much I want to pick your brains about. But first, let's, as they say in all the cliches, start at the beginning. How and why did you get into sport?
So it actually wasn't a very smooth entry into the world of sport. I wasn't very sporty as a child. My family went to school. At school, I wasn't very good at sport.
We're having a volume problem. Maybe we're getting better now.
Can you hear me there?
Turn your volume up, yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah, let me kind of try. Yeah, let me know if it.
Yeah, that's great.
And so I didn't grow up particularly sporty. My family weren't very sporty, and at school I was told I'm not very good, and they would in my school reports tell me I was sort of not trying hard enough and didn't have a good attitude and wasn't very competent either. So I actually felt quite excluded from sport. I wanted to be part of it. I loved watching the Olympics on the TV, but couldn't find a way into that world. And so I think, for me, it was about how do I find, how could I enter that? And when I got to university, I had the opportunity to start rowing. I actually didn't start from my own choice because I thought I won't be any good at it. Why would I do that? It involves getting up early in the morning. But I could see lots of other people trying it and really, really loving it. And when they had a gap and somebody got injured, they said, please, will you just sit in for a few weeks so we can keep going out as a crew? And I sort of ummed and ahed, but secretly wanted to give it a go and said, oh, well, I'll just try it in the morning and see what it's like. Got up really, really early the next day and, found a sport that I could fall in love with. And actually, the beautiful thing was I had no expectations. There was no sense I was doing this to go to the Olympics whatsoever. I just loved being on the water in a boat, which is a kind of different team experience than you get with a lot of others.
Yeah.
And things like that. You're just much closer. That was for me a transitional moment.
Yeah. Lost you a bit, but I think I got most of that. Pembroke College, Cambridge, though, and the early morning rowing. I remember I was at university as well, and all of my mates were getting up early in the morning, and it was part of not just of the sport, but it was part of a ritual and part of being a student.
Yeah, it was totally. Is that okay? Are you hearing me? Okay, I'm trying just without my speakers now. It was just such an incredible camaraderie. I loved the sort of natural environment. It was just every day slightly different, always very beautiful. And even when the rowing wasn't going well, I just always quite liked being out on the river. And you are so interdependent. You're not actually attached to each other, and yet you need each other. You can't just suddenly stop if you've had enough, and you have to therefore work with each other. You have to, if you take a bad stroke, you can't stop. You just have to keep going and try and make the next one better. And all of that was just such a great team experience. And, it really started to help me connect into, what I was capable of. It brought in that whole sort of mental, physical, emotional piece, even at a very novice level. You're always thinking about, how can I do my best? And yet I have to make sure that same time that it's helping others, because if I pull really hard at a different time from everyone else, I'm just working against others. So it's your own effort, but it needs to be aligned with others, and you always need to be mindful of that environment, the natural environment around you, the water that's always moving, the weather, and working on those three levels, yourself, but the team you're in and that context you're in. It's just such a great kind of classroom, outdoor classroom for thinking about how you can be effective.
The teamwork, obviously very important, and it sort of, was it competitive? I mean, when you start, you said it was a social thing, you wanted to fill up the boat, but there's always a competition at the end of it. I mean, there's the famous bumps at Cambridge, aren't there?
Yeah, of course, we had races, and that was a really important part of testing how we improve. Again, it was just about, we were beginners, so it's just always about learning and exploring. There would be tons of boats, 50 boats or something in a race, so you're just kind of pitching yourselves in there and seeing how you do, and then clearly got loads to work on, and let's go back and do it a bit more. So again, it was all done in a real kind of just spirit of trying and learning and having a lot of fun.
But from there, for you, it progressed into something a little bit more serious?
So it suddenly changed. Yeah, I'd say very much. Even though things got more serious at university level in terms of rowing in the boat races, for representing Cambridge in the boat race, that was a level up, of course, several levels up from where I'd started. But when I left university and decided to go on this track of trying to get in the Olympic team, things really changed. The language changed, the narrative changed. And in fact, people said to me, don't expect to have fun if you want to become an Olympic rower, which is a really extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? I think. And actually, you'll have fun if you get to the top step of the podium, but otherwise, it's serious, it's hard work. And this whole narrative kicked in around pain and sacrifice and misery, and all of this sort of what I call a slightly outdated macho narrative, which still exists in a lot of places in sport and beyond sport. And so I sort of got stuck into that, thinking that's what I have to learn if I want to become an Olympic rower. But over time, I kind of realized it wasn't helping me, and it wasn't helping most of the people around me. And that's when I started to think about challenging what success means, what high performance looks like, and what the experience is that we have.
Yeah, we just dripped out a bit. We're going to have trouble with the internet all day, I think. But anyway, were you naturally competitive? Were you naturally drawn to the success of what you were doing, or was your approach more about, how can I make this work better? How can I be better doing my individual part of this?
So I think it's a good question. I think we're always trying to work out what is success for ourselves. And again, that's part of my thinking in the book. We sometimes feel that other people tell us what success is. I've got to win this medal. I've got to get in the team. I've got to do these things. And we take that on board a little bit. So I guess, I could see other people seeing there's this track that I'm on and I should progress on. But if I'm honest about what I felt I enjoyed most and what was sort of driving me to get up on the difficult days, it was much more this learning piece about exploring what I'm capable of, finding out, can I get more out of myself in whatever way it was, technical, tactical, mental, and that sort of journey, which I think is really what, that sort of mastery mindset is what you might call it, if you're using sort of psychology terms, but just that, let me see if I can do something better tomorrow than I did today. And then let me see if I can do that again. And let me see if I can put that all together in a race. So I think you have these different levels, and we need to keep finding actually more those internal drivers that are really more powerful.
But when you get to the level of starting to be better and starting to be selected for other teams and so on, presumably there's a voice that says, how am I going to do this better? How am I going to get at it? I have to do something different to what I'm doing now. I have to give up something or put in extra something.
So I think I always felt, I hadn't reached my limit. So
Right.
There was a natural sense of I'm all the time finding I'm capable of more. I'm all the time building my physical capacity, my technique. So, it's a sport where you're just always, you never take a perfect stroke. So there's this natural sense you're on a journey. Naturally, in a way, the commitment increased, because in order to get to the next level, you need to train not just once a day, twice a day, and then not just twice a day, but 3 times a day. And so it's sort of, that kind of creeps up on you, I think. And, that's what's required to get to the next level. So I didn't mind that. I was a choice. And if I wanted to get to the next level, it's what was required.
And how did you fit it in with your job? Because you weren't a professional rower at the time.
So I carried on my studies and did some postgraduate work, which was really important to maintaining a little bit of identity beyond sport. And again, that's something that I think is so important when your life becomes wrapped up in, and your self-worth becomes wrapped up in whether you've won a medal or not. That's a really dangerous path to go down, because you have no control whether you're going to win or not. And there are all sorts of other factors involved that you cannot guarantee it. And so for me, I think one of the things that helped me again through the difficult times was to think about, was to have that switch off time afterwards, where I would, just in a few hours in the afternoon or a few hours Sunday afternoon, I'd have my studies. That was my thing, that the coach didn't control, that the sports scientists weren't measuring. And that helped me a lot. And I had a small student grant. And then when the lottery started, the funding, sort of in 97 onwards, then I had again a small grant. And so I could survive. And once you're within the squad, then a lot of the equipment, all of that stuff is all provided. So, you're surviving, you're not making money, but you've got enough to survive.
And the other side of the coin, presumably, is that person who told you don't expect to enjoy it. Were you enjoying it? Could you enjoy it whilst you were doing that? Or was it a sort of a challenge, a target? This is how I'm going to make the best of myself and my talents to get to this point. And enjoyment maybe slides off to the back.
Yeah, I found it hard in the early years in the Olympic team because of this. It was the rules of the game, the culture was all around who's the toughest, the hardest, who does more training, show no weakness, and, be really miserable if you lose a race, to show that you only want to win. And all of this, again, which I see as a bit of a primitive, kind of Rocky type mindset that actually doesn't help you improve. And so in the early years, I think I got stuck, and I was physically improving, but not really that whole picture of developing sort of holistically in terms of my mindset, having a sense of purpose to the journey. It became just about the results each time. So I got really stuck, and it was trying to get out of that was, again, the start of this thinking differently. And at that point, I definitely started to feel a bit more burnt out, a bit less joy, because there was little space for that. And if you're always trying to prove you're the best, you're better than everyone around you, you're the toughest, the last woman standing, again, that's very draining in a different way from just doing the training. So I think in the early years that, really, I got into a place where I was trying to play the game of the culture I saw around me, and that started to work against me.
And what about your teammates? Rowing is both individual and team orientated in 2s and 4s and 8s and that sort of thing. Were your teammates sharing the same outlook as you, or did you find them the examples of what you felt you should be aiming at, this ruthlessness? I
think we were all struggling with it. I think we probably, because of the sort of show no weakness piece, we didn't discuss it that openly. I mean, there were people I was close to where we would, we would support each other, and but it was very under the surface. So there was a sort of we were aware that at that time in the 90s, the women's team hadn't won medals. We were very much the sort of second tier. And so we were on this path to try and prove something that hadn't happened before, and lots of people thought maybe wasn't really possible. And I think, again, that gave us a little bit of solidarity, but it was at a minimal level. And the thing that really changed in the third Olympiad, for me, having had 2 Olympics where, I came 7th and then I came 9th. So I spent 4 years of this, 3 times a day, 7 days a week, most weeks of the year, harder and harder, physically moving on, but not with this full performance really moving on. So not with communication and focusing on the mindset and having a sense of purpose to the journey and valuing myself beyond the rowing. Without that kind of holistic piece around it, I wasn't able to get more out of myself when it mattered. So when I sort of came 9th in that second Olympics, had a bit of a crisis, stepped back for a year. And it was at that point then that I thought, right, if I am going to carry on and have one more go, it needs to be different. I need to have a different experience. I want to think about it differently. And we had a different coach come in with a slightly different approach, and psychology was starting to appear more. With that kind of support, it enabled me to have a slightly different experience and show that a different experience was possible.
You mentioned in your book the almost cutthroat dog-eat-dog type of how you get through to that point where you get your place on the boat. You're basically pitted one against one, and there's a sort of series of knockouts.
Yeah, so I mean, that's all part of that sort of macho culture, isn't it? But interestingly, although it was very competitive and brutal and tough, and we were pitted against each other every day, what that meant was that we didn't learn enough. We didn't learn from and with each other. And so when we came to race against the rest of the world, who are our real competitors, we hadn't moved on enough. And for me, that was a massive learning. We couldn't have trained any harder, but that isn't enough. We hadn't trained smart enough and we hadn't learned enough. And the big shift that then came in that third Olympics was, of course, it was still competitive and we were being timed, but the focus each day became on improvement and learning from and with each other. So it didn't matter how fast you'd gone that day. It's information, it's on the wall, but actually, this is what you've done well. This is what we're working on. This is what you're going to change. And you're going to learn from this person and they're going to learn something from you. And that is what then helped everybody's level to increase. Whereas before we'd actually kind of held each other back, and how mad is that?
So what was it that sparked the change? Was it just a new coach or a growing maturity in yourself and your teammates?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those things. So I think, we realized the results were showing that wasn't working for us, and we all felt we hadn't thrived. We'd been just surviving on the edge of a burnout. And so I think we felt that hadn't worked. So sports psychology was becoming much more prevalent, and this sense of also how this concept of separating out the performance from the results. So, your job as an athlete is to develop your performance each day. And that's what you analyze when you go to a race. Now, of course, you want good results. That hasn't changed. We still want to win. We want to do as well as we can. But that depends on others, on competitors, on luck, on the weather, on all sorts of things we can't control. And we need to get better and focus in on that sort of analysis of how we've performed, and then what are we going to do to improve again to the next race. So it means you are sort of not suspending everything on, one result in the future that you can't control, but you accept you may have a personal best performance and still come third. There's loads there then that you need to draw from that, the positives, the things you have done, and then say, okay, where do I go next? Rather than this sort of all or nothing sort of binary, I've won, therefore everything's great, or I've lost and everything's terrible. Again, it's just very binary. It's not sophisticated enough to actually think there were races when I lost, when there were the aspects of what I did that were brilliant, that were world class. So let's acknowledge that. Let's know that. Let's break down the performance, be able to understand that. And then let's look at the bits that were what reason why you didn't come first and work on those. So you become much more focused in on those, sort of breaking down the performance basics. So that was part of it. And the coach also then having this focus on improving, because basically the people who improve most are the ones who are most likely to win. So let's get world class at improving on a daily basis and having successes on a daily basis, not, successes only what happens on one day in the future that you can't control and is, full of all sorts of other, pressures, and it's hugely unlikely that it's going to work. But actually, let's have success along the way. And let's make sure if you do get on that podium, then it has a value beyond that day. It's part of a journey that's meaningful. You've had an experience, you've built a community with you, so that when you step off the podium, you've got something that lasts beyond the inanimate object of the medal or trophy that you've won. So it's a combination of factors, understanding psychology more and having that part of training, being aware of the importance of the culture, being a more supportive and challenging culture rather than a purely sort of combative one, and myself coming back wanting to have a different experience and sort of really wanting to understand what I could take from this that would have value beyond my rowing career.
Are we in the region of talking about marginal gains here? Because you talk about measuring and finding out ways in which you can improve. So that would tend to suggest you need to find ways of measuring the different elements that you can then break down and say, I can improve in this.
It is. It's about, I think, one of the things with marginal gains is making sure it's not just about doing more. It's sometimes about being smarter. It may also be about less easy to measure things.
Yeah.
So I think we were very good at saying these are the factors that are important to performance. Some are easy to measure, how fast you go, how many weights you lift, and your technique in many ways. But actually, communication within the crew is really important. Your mindset is really important. What you're focusing on in a race and in training, your recovery is really important. And these factors, we're not going to ignore them because they don't go in a spreadsheet easily. That's what we're going to work on. We're going to create our own sense of what does communication look like in the crew and how do we want to keep improving it? How are we going to give feedback to each other in a way that's effective? How are we going to keep building, and debriefing, again, our mental focus in the sessions, what worked, what didn't work, how do we want to think differently in a race? So we would actually work kind of quantitatively and qualitatively. And I think it's important that the marginal gains piece doesn't get corrupted into just a sort of sports science piece, and that it also isn't just more. And it also needs to be within a values framework. So, I always feel like the marginal gains stuff gets trotted out a lot, and it is a part of a learning mindset, but you just need to make sure you're using it kind of in a smart way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, my big reservation about it all is that you end up measuring the wrong things, or you set store on how many yards a rugby player carried the ball. You don't actually put that into any context of the game itself. And that's my concern about the little measurements that measure the wrong things, and then too much store is set by them.
Well, I also think sometimes people are focusing on marginal gains when they haven't got the basics right. So there's no point if you've got the really big stuff. But it is a way of drawing ideas in from others in the environment. So it's one of your learning tools, but it shouldn't be the sort of dominant one or the only one. And often I think it is the kind of mental skills piece that could also get squeezed out by that. And that for me is essential. And the longer I rode, the more important I realized it was to develop, the mindset, the ability to focus, the ability to switch off, the ability to understand your impact on others, and to, focus my attention on the things that will help me, not the voice that's sort of, beating myself up, all of those things. And those are the skills that outside of sports are also really, really critical and part of that kind of leadership work that I do now.
Yeah, I mean, and in sport, being a team player as well, chemistry is important as well, the chemistry between teammates.
It is relationships. And again, it doesn't have to be harmonious. all the time. It's something you need to work on and build on and be developing. And I think we're good at talking about that in sport. I often see in organizational life that people don't really look at that so much. Whereas, we would definitely see each other, at our worst and at our best, and understand what's driving each of us, because we would have different responses to races lost or to moments of challenge. And we needed to understand each other so that we don't judge, that we don't jump to the wrong conclusions, and that fundamentally we know how to support each other under pressure to deliver our best, to come together and not break apart when the pressure really comes on.
When you reached the end of that third Olympiad, you described your journey through the Olympiad. Did you feel then that was a chapter over, the end of a certain part of your life? It was time to do something else, or did you want to keep rowing for a bit or see if you could get any more success? What were your feelings then?
No, I sort of felt a peace almost. It had been a sort of long, hard decade. I think I felt that I wanted to take what I'd learned in that last period and sort of take that on with me, take that into a kind of another world, to think about how I could explore what's possible, what I'm capable of in another world. And I think I felt very relieved and very grateful that I had been able to get close, as close as I could to my best performance, at an Olympic Games. So I think I felt a peace that I hadn't felt in the previous two Olympics. So I just felt I hadn't got close to delivering that, and I hadn't had a good experience. So I think I felt sort of relieved to walk away. I still had lots of questions in my mind about how to make sense of that 10 years, which again is sort of what the book is still, was a part of helping me to do. To think about, had I been successful or not when I probably lost more races than I won, and what were other people thinking about that, and what did I really feel about it? So yeah, I was ready to move on.
Yeah, and you mentioned losing more races than you won. In fact, it's a funny part of sport that actually there has to be winners, there have to be losers. And, you will end up on the losing side or losing a match that maybe you should have won. That's an inevitable part of thing. And yet, as you say in your book, there's so much emphasis on that side of the margin as opposed to on that side of the margin. And there's so much pressure from all sides on winning being the one and only thing.
Yeah, and who does that serve? It serves a tiny majority of people, and even the people who win often don't have a good experience and end up on the top set but don't feel joy, or they have such an expectation that life will be perfect from here on in, and it isn't. You have the same character flaws as you had before you started the race, and the same relationship issues and the same individual characteristics. So that's why I felt that our model of winning doesn't really serve anyone well, and if it's not even working for the winners, let alone everyone else discarded on the way, we really need to reframe it, to think differently about it. Why would we have this narrative and this approach, this culture that sets up most people to be deemed a failure at the end of it, often in a really narrow, arbitrary way. If you're the fastest in the world at 150 meters, nobody wants to know. It's only 100 meters. You have all of these sort of arbitrary things. 3 medals is okay, 4th is terrible. And, what if the ancient Greeks had said 5 medals is good or 2 medals is good? Then we'd suddenly be going, oh, you don't want to come 6th or you don't want to come 3rd. It's very arbitrary. People within those races have done all sorts of incredible things to get there, and we discard all of that if you don't come first. But you need everybody in that Olympic final to make an incredible race that somebody will then sort of raise their game again on. They can't do that without everyone else in the race. So it's our sort of narrative around winning that I think is, it's become quite toxic, has become unhelpful, doesn't even help the winner, and it certainly doesn't help people to sustain the success, to find a way of thriving and exploring performance that is sustainable. And it's actually not good enough anymore, because people are physically very fit, and now we can't afford to flood our bodies with a sort of fear-based motivation that we're afraid of losing, and it ends careers. It means we're not in the best place to bring out an incredible, truly world-beating performance. So we really need to kind of get up to date on this and shift our thinking.
Yeah, and yet society is pushing harder and harder at the glorification of winners. And, you know, I'm just reading the papers this week. How many managers have been sacked in the Premiership? I mean, they've broken the record already this season, the number of managers sacked for not winning games, which, you know, there's going to be one winner and one loser. And, you know, some of the high profile guys being sacked, you know, they've taken their club to all sorts of glories and things. And so that's happening. I just picked up a couple of other clips about the Golf Masters, which is going ahead in August this year. And there's a headline from Rory McIlroy: the 2022 Masters was the first in a long time that I felt any joy. And he didn't win that. He just one brilliant shot, which made him happy. And
I love that. So I think the narrative from the athletes is starting to change, as that shows you. And if you think about some of the tennis players, some of the, you know, Naomi Osaka, who did some time off and again needed to re-find the joy, or even Ben Stokes. You know, there are lots of examples. Ash Barty, who loved her time and said, right, I'm done, I'm fine. And people say, well, why don't you want to win more Grand Slams? Why don't you want to be the greatest of all time? It's like, because there are other things I want to do, and I've had a good time. And again, she actually took time out of the sport to re-find the joy. She went away to play cricket. So I think the athletes get this now and want something different. But of course, you know, the theatre around it, the circus around it is not changing, because maybe that's what's selling newspapers, and there's been some commerciality, that some get commercial gains from this narrative. But I think it's on a limited time.
I ran this idea past some of the members of our Sporting Memories group the other day, and they said, but what about the fans? The fans go to a game demanding victory. We want our side to win. We don't want them to lose. We demand victory. And that, in a sense, spills over into this extraordinary sacking of all these managers. There seems to be a language and an expectation, maybe fostered by the media.
I think they've been led to that. I mean, I actually think, and I'm married to a sort of lifelong Gooner fan who is having a good time at the moment, but he will tell me it's not about going only when they win. It's about being there in the other times. That's what makes you a fan. You're there when you win, and you're there when they lose, and you're there for the team. And actually, that is the sort of the allegiance that you have, because it's impossible for everyone to win all the time. So if everybody's demanding that, most people are going to be unhappy most of the time. Why would we sell that kind of narrative? So I think you're right. People have started to expect that, because that's somehow what, you know, the kind of the media and the, you know, the sort of narratives around it have demanded. But I actually think, you know, some of these, if you go back to the, you know, the Nick Hornby books, and you know, it's all, being a fan is just about standing in the rain when you lose 2-0, and you know, and everybody's trying hard, and that's what matters. And you know, again, I think, you know, you want to see that your team is giving their all, that they're committed, and again, I think that's important. The fans want to see that, but it's that spirit really that moves you, isn't it? The great games that you remember are those incredible moments when you know things hang very finely in the balance, and it's a little moment of luck, isn't it? It's these tiny margins that tip us either way, but we then, you know, enable that to become part of a sort of binary, you know, a sort of win-lose circus. And of course, the amounts of money at stake make it really, really hard, feel high stakes, and that's something that perhaps needs to be looked at in the football world.
Yeah, it's the way of getting at it, because again, the skewed expectations are, I mean, I can't think of any sports person I've come across who said, I took up sport because I wanted to earn lots of money or because I wanted to win. Everybody, I think, without exception, said, I started playing sport because I loved the joy of the sport itself, the running, the competition, the teamwork, all of those things in different weights. But that's why people start and continue to play sport, most of us. And yet there's this sort of burden of expectation at the top end that demands, you know, this incredible sacrifice and beating yourself up and win at all costs.
And often the winning doesn't come if you go down that route. So again, that's, you know, I see it not working, and that's why we need to frame it. Doesn't even really help you. Again, you know, the way the England cricket team have sort of recreated themselves has been a great example of finding joy, simplifying things, freeing people up to play at their best. You know, Gareth Southgate, again, you know, a very different mantra. He's not there saying we're going to win the World Cup, we're going to win the World Cup. They want to, of course, but it's incredibly difficult. And his job is actually to get the players to play to their best, to create that environment on and off the pitch. That's what he can control. He can't control if a referee makes a bad decision or if balls, you know, come off the crossbar in these tiny margins. But what he can do is create that environment where the players can be at their best. And he's been very skillful at that. Serena Wiegman, the same, you know, and sometimes you kind of actually get to that peak moment when you've got all of the factors there, the quality, the mindset, the culture, and a little bit of luck goes with it. You know, and that's brilliant. And we loved watching the sort of Lionesses. But of course, they're not going to win every time. There will come a point when they can't. We have these sort of unrealistic expectations rather than just enjoying the journey. You know, because really that's what we do love. We actually all feel a bit sad when it's over. We like that hope, that sort of opportunity, what might come. That's why we watch sport.
But that seems to be in conflict to the reality that we're presented with. You mentioned in your book about education in life, in business, and so on. The structure of those things, and in school, you've got to be a winner. You've got to have winners and losers. It's our only way of measuring.
So I think we're stuck. I think we are in a bit of a transition, though. You know, again, the systems often use these simplistic measures, and schools use these sort of assessments. And when you're trapped in that, it feels like it's life-ending if you don't get your exam results. But actually, if you look out in the world, there are a lot of very successful entrepreneurs, a lot of successful people. You know, Bill Gates and others who dropped out of education. So when you're in that world, it feels, oh my God, if I don't win, it's terrible, it's life-ending. But as soon as you look a little broader in this very unpredictable, uncertain world, there are all sorts of opportunities when actually you're A-star or you're, you know, level 9, whatever it is these days. It's probably not going to be that important. And in the work I do around leadership development, there are many people with very high academic levels who aren't very good leaders, because it's a very different requirement for you to inspire others, to connect, to understand, to, you know, really help build teams, to kind of, you know, get people together in difficult times and then, you know, perhaps lead them through change. So I also see the importance of things that aren't taught in school that become critical later. And so again, we need that bigger perspective on what matters. And there are many things that are important to a child's development. We need to make sure we don't leave out because they're not on the curriculum. Those are likely to be the things that are, you know, most important later in life.
Yeah, I mean, there are school league tables, there are stars and grades and percentages, this and that and the other, and even for exams in like degree levels and so on. It's a crude measuring system, which do we have? I mean, is there an alternative to us having to stick with that measuring system with the caveats you've got, or should we try and change the measuring system completely?
You know, I definitely think there's always ways of changing how we measure things, and you know, the tyranny of metrics is seen sort of everywhere, isn't it? And in a kind of and another very sort of high cultural issue at the moment is around the Met Police, who have tons and tons of targets they've been sort of, you know, held to, and nobody has measured the culture. So we need to make sure we are measuring things that are kind of qualitative, that are about, you know, how we show up. So I think, you know, within schools, there's real scope to recognise and develop other skills. I think there's scope for us to, you know, again, have a much broader set of measures, and to recognise, to reward, you know, how people, the character development piece. There's actually lots of work going on, you know, both in the business world and in educational worlds, about what a more holistic curriculum looks like, or more holistic leadership development within the workplace. There is lots of stuff out there. We just need our sort of systems, our government systems, to think a little more broadly, a little more progressively, and to look at that. The Welsh Government is doing some great work in challenging the curriculum and creating a much more holistic curriculum, going against the sort of siloed subjects and merging subjects much more, so you look more broadly at how the subjects come together, which is of course how you encounter them in real life. So, you know, there is some hope, I think, out there. There is lots of good research around, again, bringing much more teamwork into schools, because we tend to spend more of our working life in teams, and yet we're often not very good at that. And that's part of the work I do, is helping people in organizations who are very good individually at their technical skills, but hopeless at working in a team, or just not developed the skills required for that. So again, you know, progressive education systems in the Nordic countries are very good at having, you know, most of school life based around project work, around group work that's also driven from the group. So rather than here, we're all learning exactly the same thing in our history lessons, actually you have a choice, and you might research different areas of history, or one of you will look at the economic history of a period, one of you will look at the, you know, the role of women in a period, one of you will look at, you know, a social aspect, and then you bring that together. So again, you learn from each other, with each other. So for me, that's the future. It would set us up much better for, you know, working life and just working in teams, working in communities. And I hope we can get there a little sooner. The progress sort of in our own government is a little slow on some of these things.
And having been a school teacher and taught A levels and that sort of thing, you know, you can teach kids to pass an exam, but to understand the subject or to even develop an interest in it, that, you know, I was at a fee-paying school, and the parents told me, we're not paying you to do that. And I said, well, you know, this is learning in its broadest sense.
Yeah.
But, you know, so we are up against that sort of mindset, aren't we? And
I think parents also are increasingly aware they need educating themselves sometimes. But, you know, they also probably want their child to come out of school, you know, without a mental health issue and with the ability to be a leader. So I think there's something about how you can educate expectations, and in a school setting, potentially that ought to be a little more easier than maybe, you know, re-educating a football fans at this point, although I think they all love their team regardless, and in the end, the real ones. So I think, you know, there is a piece of work, but I don't see that as impossible, because really parents want their children to flourish, to do well, and they've been told they need these exams. They've been told that's the answer, and the schools have sold that. So, you know, you kind of create a little bit of your own problem then, but I don't think it's beyond the wit to actually, you know, show how things could be different, because none of this is really going to sort of detract necessarily from the exam anyway. What we're doing is we're putting a framework around the exam that has much more meaning, that's much more lasting for all of our children.
Do we have to lick the media into shape, or if so, how can we do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one, isn't it? I think in the sports media, you know, I think some of the slow media, some of the different options now we have to, you know, whether it's Tortoise or some of the more thoughtful pieces in the Atlantic, these offer us a different perspective, a more thoughtful perspective. And, you know, social media means we can hear from athletes direct, so we can hear their story direct. So I think that is starting to shift. And the print media are being very slow to shift from just giving kind of results every week in, week out, and still largely male sport. But I think people are looking elsewhere, and that field will increasingly diversify. And, you know, all of the podcast world shows that people like listening to stories. They actually want something a bit more thoughtful. And the success of podcast shows as well that people want to, you know, that's always about delving deeper into a story, understanding the bigger context of what's happening around an event. That for me shows there's an appetite for this.
I haven't got much time to talk about your diplomatic career, because I've been so fascinated by exploring these issues with you. But how did you find going into the diplomatic side of things after sport? Were there things you could transfer, or things you had to learn new?
Yeah, both of that, really. I think it was refreshing to go into a different world, and to go into a world where things were really high stakes. You feel when you sit on the Olympic start line that it's life or death. It really isn't. And, you know, that's an important perspective to have on, you know, the privilege that it is to do sport at a high level. And I had studied languages and international politics. And so it was an area I was really fascinated by. In many ways, I see foreign policy as human behavior on the biggest stage of all, with the biggest stakes of all. And that's sort of what I'm most interested in now in my work, is that human behavior piece, whether it's it's in a sports organization or a business organization. So I loved being able to immerse myself in another very intense world, a world that mattered, and a world where we worked in teams a lot, particularly in the sort of negotiation work that I did. And of course, having got that sense of what it means to make to be an effective team, that was very helpful. What it was like to work under pressure, again, those things were enormously helpful, and those are the sorts of skills that I kind of now do a lot of work around helping people develop, because we need them, whether we're at school, in sport, in business, whatever it is we're doing. And those are the bits that don't get taught yet at school that are so critical. So, definitely that human side was very transferable. But equally, I had to sort of get used to being in an organisation where people have very different motivations and very different sort of, you're not committed to doing it at all costs in the same way that you might be in an Olympic world where you'll do it to the exclusion of everything else in your life. So I had to relearn balance. I'm probably relearning balance, as my family would probably say. It's an ongoing project, but slowly getting there.
Did you relish the responsibility that came with this? I mean, this is not just sport, it's real life, it's, fates of nations and all that sort of thing. Did you relish the responsibility, or were you a little frightened by it?
I think I was daunted by it. I think one should be daunted by it. And you're part of a team, you're not making decisions on your own. Again, you have to do your best, understanding that's, alignment with others around you. And so, not being afraid to do difficult things, not shying away from that was something that I felt able to do, perhaps coming from that background of, being courageous in those moments and understanding that's the role, but also having a lot of support around me. And I liked that sort of sense that people, you weren't hung out on your own. There was always people there trying to support you. So, I really appreciated that as well. And that gave you the opportunity to play your part, but you're always within the team of, the British team, and then often you're within an international group as well. And so it's really, how can you help that group to function best? How can we make the best decisions in a very imperfect world with imperfect information, and keep that learning going, being really humble about what role you can possibly play in what are often very complex situations.
They must be very complex because, in sport, as you said before, it's a sort of binary thing. There's a winner and a loser. In conflict resolution, presumably, it's not so simple as that. It must be a win-win situation. Both sides have got to come out thinking they've won or gained or made the right moves for a general good.
Yeah, and that was sort of how I encountered this concept of success from a really different perspective. That the biggest key in negotiations is the mindset. If you're in a zero-sum game conversation, it's not going to go well because there'll be one winner, and it won't be a sustainable agreement because somebody's lost. Yeah. And that generally doesn't move the situation forward for anything other than the short term, and then you're back at the negotiating table, or worse, you're back into conflict. So, it gave me another lens on this importance of shifting mindsets to be able to see a win-win solution as, sharing something, but a much bigger pie is where we need to get to. And a lot of our work was around that psychological aspect of having conversations. It's almost no point coming to the table in that zero-sum game world. And that's the skill, the opportunity as a diplomat to try and help people think differently, to really understand their perspective, to understand why they see the world like that. There are often very good reasons. And to do what you can to sort of walk alongside them, to help them to, could you be part of something really different where actually your country moves forward and you play a role in that, rather than, you getting what you want for the next 6 months and then we're back around the table and nothing's really moved forward. So, those sorts of conversations were the key, and these changes don't happen quickly. You have to be very patient. You have to try and keep connecting, persistent. And, sometimes you can get the movement, which can then be really transformational, but it doesn't always happen.
Is that the sort of thing we should be encouraging in sport administration, in the guys who run and own sports clubs? Because for them, competition is about wiping the opposition out. And yet in sport, you need to have people to play against. So it's a sort of difficult one to marry the two types of opinion, or not?
I actually think the more progressive thinkers in sport totally get this, that they have to think about sustainable success, not throwing everything at it for the next 6 months to win the next match. Actually, you've got to play the long game. You've got to be set up for that. Otherwise, you're on a roller coaster again of, where you get great, and then if something doesn't work, it's terrible. And you need to be thinking differently. I think that's why we see some of the kind of a different type of manager coming through. If you look at the top in the sort of Guardiola's, Klopps, they are different thinkers from others. And I think if you also look at the sort of role of the football director that comes into a club to try and create a bit more sustainability, it's tough because of these still huge short-term pressures. But I think people get that. I think, in the Olympic world as well, we've had, so many athletes with, we've got increasing mental health issues. I think it's something somebody mentioned in the questions, and, that actually shortens an athlete's career. So the money you're investing in them, where you push them to get to this Olympics, but now, they could have gone to one or two more, but you've broken them along the way. That it just doesn't make sense. And so I think, people are starting to see this. Again, I think we're in a bit of a transition. Some still playing the old game because that's the game they knew, that's the game they've grown up with. But I think increasingly there's a bit of a look to the long term so that sport can actually be seen slightly differently, and this move into, winning well rather than just winning at all costs. Because if we end up in a place where, you've doped, or, even Johnny Wilkinson now, who says how damaged he was by his experiences on the pitch, well, that's not encouraging the next generation. That's not something we want to repeat. What we've seen in gymnastics happening, that's not good for the sustainability of that sport, for a sport that's huge in this country and so many people can enjoy. So I think there is some shift, and there are some good leaders who get this, but we've definitely got kind of further to go on that journey.
So where do these leaders come from? Do they come from a sporting background like you, or do they come from a business background, or from a management background? Where are we going to find these people?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily one place they come from, but what they have in common is often they're very grounded people. They get the bigger picture. They understand that, a single loss is a short-term thing, but it's actually about what your bigger contribution to society might be, what sport could be, the sorts of lessons that we want sport to be teaching the next generation, which isn't a sort of macho win at all costs attitude, but actually, how do you get the best out of yourself over a long period of time, and how do you manage the inevitability of losing in a way that you can still take something from it and come back and have another go. And so, I think it's people who see the bigger picture, who, realize that we've got a bit of a crisis in many cultures and can see a different way. They're often people who naturally have, I think, an innate sort of sense of that bigger purpose, and they are not there. They're not ego driven. They're not coming into it to make themselves look good. And then you're able to really lead in a different way.
Yeah, and in a way, it's divorcing sport at the top level from sport for all. That idea about it's not the winning or the losing, it's the taking part. That's a message that really we should be trying to push to everybody in society. It's the taking part in sport that's the most important thing. And
I don't like the divorce between the two. I think it's artificial. We've created it, and we've showed that we can win medals without supporting the grassroots or improving the grassroots. And I'd like us now to put as much money into connecting the two and seeing how we might create a different experience on both sides. Because again, we have too many athletes that do win, that do well, but feel depressed or unfulfilled and crash afterwards. Whether it's the likes of Victoria Pendleton and Johnny Wilkinson, and there's just any number of athletes now that have come out and don't have a great story to tell. So what's the point of that? And they've often become divorced from those communities, from the grassroots. So, we see this move to kind of create a more purpose-driven athlete, that they have something beyond their sport, and that helps both their performance and their long-term health. I'm an advisor with the True Athlete Project, which is a brilliant non-profit organisation that offer mentoring programs and a way of helping athletes to have a more holistic experience, which we see only helping the performance. So this isn't sort of detracting from it. It's about, let's actually actually create a path that can be fulfilling in a different way, you know, and help you to explore your performance and keep you connected to the community around you. So I'd really like to see us stop that kind of division.
Yes, I mean, it's important that we should all recognise the benefits of physical exercise, which is ultimately good for the health of the nation. And there are so many no-brainer arguments in favour of it, and yet, you know, there are still lots of people say, "Oh, I don't do sport. I never liked sport," or, you know, they confuse exercise. And how do you square that circle?
So that is something I care passionately about. I sort of wrote in The Guardian recently about, yes, the sort of our need to revamp PE. PE is not seen as important at school, and yet it's crucial to the health of, it's so important that young people create healthy habits for life. Sport is often, you know, people are excluded from it. They feel they can't do it, seen very narrowly. If you can't do rugby or football or hockey, then this isn't for you. But we need to get this nation active for the long term, in order to ensure that we both, you know, can get the best out of education, but also, you know, to help ourselves from a health perspective. I love this concept of the centenarian Olympics, i.e. we should be thinking about what do we need to do in order to make sure if we get to 100, we're still mobile, we're still able to have a good quality of life, we're still able to move, and to think a little bit more about that rather than can we win the next local league sort of, you know, next summer or something. Schools need to be thinking about that, not winning the local league, but actually do your children leave you know, with active habits? You know, they should be judged on 10 years later, are your children actually being active? I'd love us to start tracking that. And again, I've worked with some sports directors who get that, you know, both independent and in the state sector, who understand what sport can bring children, that is, again, literally win-win. And yet it's seen so narrow. And in the state schools, it's often, you know, even the sort of advisory 2 hours doesn't happen. Nobody's really enforcing that. And, you know, it's seen as secondary. It's not a core subject. So let's make PE a core subject. Let's think about activity during, you know, school life, not just in PE lessons. You know, again, a rethink then is so essential.
Yeah, and it's not just the next 10 years, it's the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. You know,
absolutely.
In the field, I'm doing a little bit of work in dementia, and it is proven that the more you exercise, the less your dementia is likely to be effective or difficult for you. You can ward off dementia by exercise. It's incredibly important for all of us, all through our lives, to be exercising if we can, for all sorts of reasons, not just our own mental and physical health, but for the health of the nation. Sorry, I've jumped on my soapbox. It's been brilliant talking to you, Cath, and so much enjoyed our conversation. I really did learn an awful lot from you. I hope our listeners on the Sporting Memories and the Goldster podcast did as well. And I wish you all the very best in your next projects and whatever you're doing. And, you know, keep banging that drum. You've been brilliant. And if future sport and exercise is in your hands, I think we'll all be very lucky. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks for the conversation. Appreciate it.